Africa, before slavery. African proverb. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Frederick Douglass. The most pathetic thing is for a slave who doesn't know that he is a slave. Malcolm X. Every man is rich in excuses to safeguard his prejudices, his instincts, and his opinions. Ancient Egypt. Africa's history did not begin in slavery, and despite the peculiarity, horror, and duration of enslavement of Africans, slavery occupies a minor time frame. Some of the most notable civilizations in human history come out of Africa. Africa has been a key continent in the development of the modern and historical world. What kind of world do we live in when the views of the oppressed are expressed at the convenience of their oppressors? Owen Alik-Shaeda. We are not Africans because we are born in Africa, we are Africans because Africa is born in us. Chester Higgins, Jr. Leave no brother or sister behind the enemy line of poverty. Harriet Tubman. Linguistics and African Reality. Religion in Africa. African Cultural Footprint. Somali, Money and Civil War. Africa before slavery. African influence in Barbados. If we stand tall, it is because we stand on the shoulders of many ancestors. African proverb. If we do not stop oppression when it is a seed, it will be very hard to stop when it is a tree. Alik-Shaeda. If the future doesn't come toward you, you have to go fetch it. Zulu proverb. It takes more than a horrifying transatlantic voyage chained in the filthy hold of a slave ship to erase someone's culture. Maya Angelou. It makes no difference what language Africans speak if our first language is not truth. Hilary Muhammad, NOI. Africa before slavery. Africa's history did not start with slavery. Alik-Shaeda and Hakeem Adi 2005-2008. Notes. It takes more than a horrifying transatlantic voyage chained in the filthy hold of a slave ship to erase someone's culture. Africa's history did not begin in slavery, and despite the peculiarity, horror, and duration of enslavement of Africans, slavery occupies a minor time frame. Beyond cotton fields and civil rights in the 120,000 years of African history, 0.5% of African history. In the last 50 years much has been done to combat the false and negative views about the history of Africa and Africans, which were developed in Europe in order to justify the transatlantic slave trade and European colonial rule in Africa that followed it. Unfortunately, the Eurocentric take on Africa and Eurocentric linguistics has distorted how some African scholars see Africa. Even those claiming to be progressive, discuss Africa as history's perceptual victim without any agency. Relegated to a simple disparaging color black or negroid, without even the ability to define anything in reality, even oneself. But this is how they made Africans into slaves. By destroying/fracturing/interrupting that connection to Africa's great past, and because there is no connection, Africans globally have accepted being thugs and hoe*es in someone else's society. Pimps and dealers as opposed to sultans and kings. Builders of drug networks as opposed to builders of civilization. After all, education shows Africa as nothing more than a primitive place overrun by cannibal savages. Many people have this view of Africa sitting still and being imposed on from outside. They forget that Africa was an active trade partner with Arabia and China. There is even a special section in Israel for Orthodox Christian Ethiopian monks for hundreds of years for when they make pilgrimage. Africans have been to China before the European, not as slaves but as partners. Africans discovered Europe before Europe discovered us, Islamic Spain, etc. History, right now, needs to be put into perspective. Many have been draining the African historical record by boxing in what is, and what does not constitutes an authentic African experience. Eurocentric terminologies place certain concepts outside of the African domain with this habit of tribalizing Africa: dark, pagan, licentious, unorganized, base, and emotive. The legacy of washing out Africa's historical record can be summed up by the racist words of the Scottish philosopher David Hume. I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual, eminent either in action or in speculation. No ingenious manufacture among them, no arts, no sciences. David Hume. In the 19th century the German philosopher Hegel simply declared Africa is no historical part of the world. This openly racist view, that Africa had no history, was repeated by Hugh Trevor Roper, Regius Professor of History at Oxford University, as late as 1963. The legacy of the African Holocaust has made a profound effect on African studies, where the default attitude is to deny African have contributed anything to what is considered civilization. Africans are playing on a chessboard where all the pieces are white. The volumes of published works by the Hitlers of the African Holocaust is impossible for Africans to gain any foothold and authorities' stance in their history. So Ethiopia is a great civilization, so it must be outside of African origin. Great Zimbabwe, ancient Egypt, Moorish, Islamic Spain, are categorically denied as having anything African in them. Africa had a history, long before the Europeans came to our shores. But the Europeans came to our shores, and because they were attracted by what those who came first found, in our case it's gold, and the first European establishment which established in Ghana was established at a place called El Mina, the mine, because gold was so abundant, and they came with their manufacturing products in exchange for gold. So the Europeans initially came to our country to trade as partners. It is perhaps the error of the slave trade which changed the perceptions of Europeans about Africans, when our own people were regarded as commodities. Isaac Ose, 500 years later. African kingdoms. See also African kingdoms. Africa produced a plethora of advanced civilizations. The most notable of these is the Nile Valley civilization from 3000 BCE, founding of the first dynasty, all the way until it was conquered by Persia around 525 BCE. So about 2500 years. This was followed by the great civilizations of Aksum and Dmt, and later by the great Islamic civilizations of the Sahel, Mali, Songhai, and the last in the later Sokoto. The famous Hajj of Musa Musa in the 13th century was so profound it altered the currency of every country he passed through with his entourage. Later the Sokoto Caliphate is an Islamic spiritual community in northern Nigeria, led by the Sultan of Sokoto. It was founded during the Fulani War in 1809 by Usman Dan Fodio. Throughout the 1800s, it was one of the largest and most powerful empires in sub-Saharan Africa until British conquest in 1903. Despite the new wave of myths regarding Nubia and Kemet, ancient Egypt, it is clear that Kemet and Nubia were neighboring African civilizations just as Aksum and Nubia. Difference does T mean Nubia was a black race and Kemet wasn't. Both groups were ethnic groups of indigenous African origin. The ethnic differences were no more significant than Ethiopians versus Kenyans. The largest empire in ancient African history was the Songhai Empire with its iconic leader Askia. The Aksum Empire was the third largest African empire at 1.25 million square kilometers. In the 6th century, the kingdom of Aksum, was doing what many elsewhere had been doing, pursuing trade and empire. Its exports of ivory, glass crystal, brass, and copper items, and perhaps slaves, among other things, had brought prosperity to the kingdom. Blackness and slavery. See also African race language Alik Shaeda. African people not fitting the European-imposed black archetype. The people of Africa is more than a name, it is linked to indigenous rights and issues of sovereignty. Blackness fails at every level in both the historical and political context. Africans are the natural people of Africa, the hair, the skin, are all specific adaptations to living in the African landscape. The motherland of these adaptations and the cultures is primarily Africa, hence the relevance of the name. 2. Black history is the history of enslavement, African history is the history of humanity. If there are no white people, could there be black people? For over 40,000 years there were only native people of Africa on the planet, and since there were no white people there could not have been black people, since everyone would have been black. And if all the white people vanished from the earth, would the remaining black people still be black? So the older group must define itself relative to the European newcomers? Would it not make far more logical, historically, linguistically, and social to describe people by their land of origin? Negro equals Negroid equals colored equals nigger equals black, all associated with color, none are connected to a continent. Now compare this to Asiatic, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid, all are tied to land, all can be located on a map but not so Negroid/black. Black and white are therefore debunked as regressive incomplete terms for describing people. For all of recorded history we see in every conflict a central theme, that of land. So critical as humans need land to grow crops on, to source water from, see Golan Heights, they need a place to build cities and a place to harvest mineral wealth from. So attaching your identity to land makes sense, attaching your identity to an abstract color, does not. Black and African are not interchangeable in any logical sense. For the vast civilizations that existed in Africa, Christianity existed in Ethiopia long before there was the Church of England. Islam existed in Africa before it even reached outside of what is today the hinterland of Saudi Arabia. Libraries and universities existed in Islamic cities such as Timbuktu, where advanced mathematics and astrology were studied. In Ethiopia for hundreds of years the Kebra Negast was written in the only surviving African native script Ge'ez. Ethiopia was the only African nation to actively repel colonialism and is one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. Africa has always been part of the biblical, Jewish, and Islamic world. It was a common sight to see Ethiopians in Rome or anywhere in the known world. Modern-day Israel was also a site for Ethiopian pilgrimage and Mecca was for Muslim Africa. The historical trip of Kanka Musa was said to alter the economy of every state he passed through on his way to Mecca. So the story of Africa we are still clinging to is victim. Mansa Musa clearly and utterly demonstrates not only that Africans were powerful, but also international. Mansa Musa remains the only man in recorded history to singularly control the gold value of the entire Mediterranean and was one of the richest men in history. Some of the most notable civilizations in human history come out of the Nile Valley in Africa, of these we know KMT, ancient Egypt, and Nubia. Still today Western historians, as in the past, have tried to deny the African identity of these kingdoms, which are geographically located in Africa. Yet no one has seriously said Greece was not a European civilization, or ancient China was not an Asian civilization. So this double standard is the legacy of the whitewashing of Africa history to satisfy the myth that Africa is outside of humanity, civilization, and thus suitable for harvest by more advanced nations. The denial of African agency has had a profound impact on how the world sees general history in the context of the African agent. Christian history is African history, Uxum. The history of world civilizations is the history of Africa. The history of Islam is the history of Africa, first Hijra, Sokoto, Islamic Spain, you cannot divorce one from the other. The history of humanity is an African history. History and development didn't happen in isolation of African agency. Slavery and colonialism did victimized Africans, but Africans are not history's perpetual victims. Africans in antiquity had agency and made conscious choices which contributed to the development of humanity. In Uxum, the course that Esna took to make Christianity the state religion was based on his sovereign agency. Regardless of orientation, to believe Africans have been on the receiving end of other people's whims is to deny African human agency. Agency swings both ways, and as much as it holds us accountable, it also defines our station in civilization. Religion in Africa before slavery. Alik Shaeda. See also African belief, traditional healing, Islam and Africa, Vodun, African Christian. Religion is a fundamental, perhaps the most important, influence in the life of most Africans. Joa Walalu. Most spiritual systems practiced by Africans, whether native or mainstream, are organized religions. The rituals of voodoo, Orisha, Sirar, etc. are all highly organized, and without exception, function in communal setting. They all have degrees of a priest class, ceremony, immolation, libation, religious holidays, creation stories, saints, divine systems of punishment and reward. The key difference is most native or traditional faiths are usually ethno-specific and generally lack a written tradition, and a prophet. Awalalu, they also are less proselytizing compared to Islam and Christianity. One beyond this, even indigenous belief systems share elements in common with each other, as well as with the Abrahamic faiths and other indigenous belief systems around the world. African spirituality is the spirituality of African people, independent of the naming systems given to the cultures/rituals of those spiritual beliefs. African spirituality lives and is applied within of Islam, e.g. Tijaniya, Judaism, e.g. Hebrew Israelite, Christianity, e.g. Tewahedo, as much as it does inside of Vodun, or Odinani. Outside of the Abrahamic faiths, and perhaps faiths found in the diaspora, many African religions are inseparable from the ethnic identity and culture. So the religion of the Sira is historically part of Sira identity, the religion of the Mesa is part of Mesa cultural identity. One erroneous idea is that all Africans had one pagan religion at some point in time. There is no original religion for an entire continent of people, which is static over 60,000 years of African history. Religion all over the world is invariable tied to lifestyle, so as people move from nomadic to sedentary, from chiefdoms to city-state, from hunters to agriculturist, religion evolved to suit. There is also a profound relationship to culture, and more often than not, cultures are not destroyed by new faiths but modified to accommodate the tenets of the new religion. We see this in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The greater the cultural agency of the group, the more they Africanize the incoming faiths into their political cultural domain. Hidden history and romance? Specific knowledge of self vs vague romantic fantasy. It was acceptable in the 60s to just state we were kings and queens in Africa. Black History Month comes and goes and all we are still comfortable with this tired one-liner. But when you ask the Greeks about Greek history, they are pretty specific and can speak about Battle of Thermopylae around 400 BCE. When you ask the Italians, they tell you about Hadrian's Wall, Nero, the Colosseum, and the conquest of Germania. When you ask the Chinese, they tell you of the terracotta sculptures depicting the armies of Qin Shi Huang around 209 BCE. When you ask the Persians, they tell you about Xerxes and the Golden Age in Baghdad in the 9th century with specific reference to contributions to science. When you ask the Indians, they tell you about the Taj Mahal commissioned in 1632 by the Mughal Emperor, Shah Jahan. They all make films and cultural references to their history. Now, despite the free flow of information, Africans are content with "we were kings and queens in Africa." Never heard of Menelik, never heard of Askia, never heard of Sokoto, Aksum, never heard of ancient Ghana, never heard of Lalibela or the Great Mosque in Goa. And year after year this total lack of knowledge of self gets worse. And we are sending our children into the world with vague mythology and accusations of they stole everything from us and wonder why they have no self-confidence. And what is the excuse? Have we not also made films and written books? So the only person who destroyed or hide African history is the trivial people who do not study it. Scripts of Africa. Alik Shaeda. Ancient Africa had a predominantly, but not exclusively, oral tradition. But Ethiopia for 1000s of years has used, and still uses a GEEZ-based native script. And apart from Ajami, Arabic script for African languages, West Africa had Vai and Ensabidi. Not to mention the obvious Nile Valley, ancient Egyptian and Nubian, scripts at the beginning of civilization. Ethiopia as a world power. Alik Shaeda. In 522, before Khosrau's reign, a group of Monophysite Ethiopians led an attack on the dominant Himyarites of southern Arabia. The local Arab leader was able to resist the attack, and appealed to the Sasanians for aid, while the Ethiopians subsequently turned towards the Byzantines for help. The Ethiopians sent another force across the Red Sea and this time successfully killed the Arab leader and replaced him with an Ethiopian man to be king of the region Fry ancient Iran in 531. Justinian suggested that the Ethiopians of Yemen should cut out the Persians from Indian trade by maritime trade with the Indians. The Ethiopians never met this request because an Ethiopian general named Abraha took control of the Yemenite throne and created an independent nation. After Abraha's death, one of his sons, Mahdikarab, went into exile while his half-brother took the throne. After being denied by Justinian, Mahdikarab sought help from Khosrau, who sent a small fleet and army under Commander Variz to depose the current king of Yemen. After capturing the capital city Sana'a, Mahdikarab's son, Saif, was put on the throne. Justinian was ultimately responsible for Sasanian maritime presence in Yemen. By not providing the Yemenite Arabs support, Khosrau was able to help Mahdikarab and subsequently established Yemen as a principality of the Sasanian Empire. Mental slavery. The African Holocaust is the greatest continuing tragedy the world has ever seen. It was also the most impacting social event in the history of humanity. Not only in terms of scale but also in terms of legacy and horror. It is a Holocaust which is constantly denied, mitigated, and trivialized. The African Holocaust is whitewashed and Africans denied their human value and treated as a people only suitable for slavery. The MAFA reduced humans with culture and history to a people invisible from historical contribution, mere labor units, commodities to be traded. From this Holocaust/MAFA the modern racial social hierarchy was born which continues to govern the lives of every living human where race continues to confer, or obstruct, privilege and opportunity. And in the 21st century the legacy of enslavement manifests itself in the social-economic status of Africans globally. Without a doubt Africans globally constitute the most oppressed, most exploited, most downtrodden people on the planet, a fact that testifies to the untreated legacy of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. Not only is this reality in the social-economic spectrum, it is also experienced in the academic and political value the MAFA receives compared to the Jewish genocide. However, it is estimated that 40–100 million people were directly affected by slavery via the Atlantic, Arabian, and Trans-Saharan routes. Some historians conclude that the total loss in persons removed, those who died on the arduous march to coastal slave marts and those killed in slave raids, exceeded the 65–75 million inhabitants remaining Africa at the trade's end. But no one knows the exact number. Many died in transport, others died from diseases or indirectly from the social trauma left behind in Africa. Not only was transatlantic slavery of demographic significance, in the aggregate population losses but also in the profound changes to settlement patterns, epidemiological exposure, and reproductive and social development potential. And perhaps one profound difference between Arab and European systems was that Africa's development potential was being experienced outside of Africa, as opposed to inside Africa. The perpetuators of the African Holocaust, as do their descendants, slept snugly in their bed with the comforting ideology of an inferior African and a super-European. And while the ramifications are different in today's societies, still a large percentage of the ideology which shapes the modern world is articulated via this lens of white supremacy. This perception is acted out in all areas of people activity and embedded in the mainstream ideologies of European descendants today. Evidence is the ongoing untreated stench of global anti-African sentiment which poisons and pollutes African development. African is not a foreign name. Alik Shaeda. Some say, Africa was a foreign name given to us. If this is true, it was given to us by our contemporaries, not our conquerors. However, the word has Berber-Tunisian origins meaning a sunny place, Ifriqiya. Some claim Romans appropriated this word, from which it is believed the modern word Africa came about to describe the entire continent. In addition, Africa is a unique name of a place and Africans are simply people who are native to that place. And over the course of history different names such as Habesha and Takruri were used to refer to African people of various regions, Ethiopia and West Africa respectively. Black as an identity ultimately sets Africans outside of their connection to history and culture. Black does not connect us to Kemet, it only goes back 500 years ago. Hence, Black people are an urban people/culture and urban people's history is 5 minutes old. In addition, because it is a term placed on us, we have no basis for its control, and hence they are able to say, ancient Egyptians weren't black. Black has no meaning, except the meaning they place on it, if and when they chose. Africa, the birthplace of humanity. Hakim Adi. We now know that far from having no history, it is likely that human history actually began in Africa. The oldest evidence of human existence and that of our immediate ancestors has been found in Africa. In July 2002, further evidence of the existence of early hominids in Africa was found with the discovery of the fossilized remains of what has been called Sahelanthropus chadensis, thought to be between 6 to 7 million years old, in Chad. The latest scientific research points to the fact that all human beings are likely to have African ancestors. See Ethiopia. Africa's international relations. Hakim Adi. Africa, in European writings, was considered the dark continent. It existed on the fringes of European comprehension. However, Europeans were very late in terms of contact with Africa. A vibrant international trade was in existence thousands of years before their arrival. China in the 10th and 11th centuries traded with East Africa, which boomed during the Ming dynasty under the leadership of the Chinese Muslim seafarers Cheng Ho. East African emissaries visited China during this period to pay homage to the Chinese emperor. Africa's interface with Europe is also very ancient. Islamic Spain was ruled and governed for nearly 800 years by a condominium of African Moors from North and West Africa and Arabs in the 7th century. During this period, African leaders such as Yaqub al-Mansur stood undefeated in his conquest of Andalusia. He sold European prisoners of war to chiefs in his native Africa. 800 years passed until the Africans and Arabs were expelled in 1492, around the time Cristobal Colón made his maiden voyage. Prior to Islamic Spain, there were 2,500-year-old African masks found in Cadiz. This testifies to an ancient international trade of equal civilizations. The legend of African Hannibal Barca assault on the Romans makes it clear that Africans in fact discovered Europe long before Europe discovered Africa. Africans have always populated Europe. It was commonplace to see Ethiopians going about their business in ancient Rome. Up until 1550, 10% of Portugal was African, but intermarriage has absorbed the African presence in the population. Denial of agency. Alik Shaeda. For far too long, a majority of Africans have been indifferent to misrepresentations about who they are. They have remained objects of the ill-informed caricatures of a once glorious heritage disfigured by colonial and post-colonial predators. Chidon Wangwu. Regardless of what is said, the destruction of African civilizations in the physical and now in the historical records is an ongoing enterprise. There is a mental toolkit that the African student needs to engage anytime studying history. Unlike everyone else, when an African speaks, he is fighting two battles, proving he is valid as a human to contribute and then proving he is right. This double burden is due to the historical disinheritance created by racism. When history is reduced from all the pages to the underlining conclusion, we find, regardless of if the author is British liberal, American conservative, or Australian, the conclusion is the same: Africa has fostered nothing the Western world considers artifacts of civilization. With few exceptions, this is the underlying summarization on Africa, the pathology of discrediting and takeaway. Eurocentric scholarship would rather credit Arabs, Indians, Chinese and even aliens for the pyramids rather than native Africans. The real difference between the liberal and the conservative is that the conservative will control you by external mechanisms, sanctions/war, the liberal will control you by internal mechanism, charities/missionaries, agenda setters. Both have an adverse reaction every time African agency lifts its head up. My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint Dominique, Haiti, is not so much based on considerations of commerce and money, as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world. Napoleon Bonaparte. There is nothing glorious in Africa that has not been reassigned to white ownership. And some are confused about terms like Arab, but Arabs from the perspective of Eurocentric history are a Middle Eastern Caucasoid, so quite happily will they reassign ancient Egypt or Islamic Spain to Arab people. W.E.B. Du Bois was right when he said, "We cannot, if we are sane, divide the world into whites, yellows, and blacks, and then call blacks white." He might have said that it would be equally as strange to call them Mediterranean, Hamitic, or 100 other euphemisms taking authorship outside the racial property of African people. Black in the North American context. Du Bois. The social construction of race in America does not rely on skin color. African Americans, as Asante notes, constitute the most heterogeneous group in the United States biologically, but perhaps one of the most homogeneous socially. Karenga notes that it is playing Europe's racial game to concede that Egyptians are white or Asian if they don't look like a Eurocentric version of a West African. Furthermore, Ethiopians and Somalis, perhaps, resemble the ancient Egyptians and ancient Nubians more than any other peoples, and they are, even by Eurocentric standards, African. Unless we revive the hoary Hamitic myth. The question for the discerning student of history is, why do all the conclusions always serve to empower Europeans and disempower Africans? It does not matter if they use archaeology or genetics, linguistics or reasoning, the conclusions always make a deposit towards the greatness of Europe, and a deduction from the glory of Africa. The Eurocentric opinions of Orientalist scholarship has been copied into Africanist Europhone writings. These attitudes reflect a failure to account for the full complexities and heterogeneity of Islam and its history in sub-Saharan Africa. African slave systems. Al-Qaeda. Slavery was not only an aspect of history, today slavery is still a world problem. Millions of people are trapped in domestic slavery from China to USA. The line that defines what is and isn't slavery is blurred, and there is no secret that when ethnic groups and nationalities fought in wars, the vanquished were given into a system of subservience to the victors, eschew rules of war. However, let not the word slavery allow an analog to what happened on the plantations of Jamaica, Brazil, and America. In Africa, there were no fields filled with men and women toiling away to the crack of a whip. There was no place where so-called slaves outnumbering their enslavers. Chattel slavery did not exist within Africa, but serfdom, servitude or vassalship did, as it did in most of Europe and the rest of the world. In addition, this vassalship was scattered and infrequent, it was never the commerce of the land. Most non-free people could amass wealth, and upward mobility was very frequent. Some, as in the case of Ali Colon, ascended the ranks to become rulers. Many enslaved people were employed in high government office with virtually no restrictions on their native language, religion, etc. Trade, cultures, and civilizations in Africa. See African kingdoms. Africa's great civilizations made an immense contribution to the world, which are still marveled at by people today. Ancient Egypt, which first developed over 5,000 years ago, is one of the most notable of these civilizations and one of the first monarchies anywhere in the world. However, even before the rise of this civilization, the earlier monarchy of Ta Seti was founded in Nubia, in what is today the Sudan. Egypt of the pharaohs is best known for its great monuments and feats of engineering, such as the pyramids, but it also made great advances in many other fields too. The Egyptians produced early forms of paper and a written script. They developed the calendar too and made important contributions in various branches of mathematics, such as geometry and algebra, and it seems likely that they understood and perhaps invented the use of zero. They made important contributions in mechanics, philosophy, irrigation, and architecture. In medicine, the Egyptians understood the body's dependence on the brain over 1,000 years before the Greek scholar Democritus. Some historians now believe that ancient Egypt had an important influence on ancient Greece, and they point to the fact that Greek scholars such as Pythagoras and Archimedes studied in Egypt, and that the work of Aristotle and Plato was largely based on earlier scholarship in Egypt. For example, what is commonly known as Pythagoras' theorem, was known to the ancient Egyptians hundreds of years before Pythagoras' birth. How Europe learned from Africa. Hakim Adi. Some of the world's other great civilizations, such as Kush, Aksum, Ghana, Mali, and Great Zimbabwe, also flourished in Africa, and some major scientific advances were known in Africa long before they were known in Europe. Towards the middle of the 12th century, the North African scientist, Al-Idrisi, wrote, "What results from the opinion of philosophers, learned men, and those skilled in observation of the heavenly bodies, is that the world is as round as a sphere, of which the waters are adherent and maintained upon its surface by natural equilibrium." Africans were certainly involved in transoceanic travel long before Europeans, and there is some evidence to suggest that Africans crossed the Atlantic and reached the American continent, perhaps even North America, as early as 500 BC. In the 14th century, the Syrian writer, Al-Murid, wrote about the voyage of the Emperor of Mali who crossed the Atlantic with 2,000 ships but failed to return. Africans in East and Southeastern Africa also set up great civilizations that established important trading links with the kingdoms and empires of India and China long before Europeans had learned how to navigate the Atlantic Ocean. When Europeans first sailed to Africa in the 15th century, African pilots and navigators shared with them their knowledge of transoceanic travel. It was gold from the great empires of West Africa, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which provided the means for the economic take-off of Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries and aroused the interest of Europeans in Western Africa. An early historian in the 9th century wrote, "The king of Ghana is a great king. In his territory are mines of gold." When the famous historian of Muslim Spain, Al-Bakri wrote about Ghana in the 11th century. He reported that its king rules an enormous kingdom and has great power. The king of Ghana was said to have an army of 200,000 men and to rule over an extremely wealthy trading empire. In the 14th century, the West African Empire of Mali was larger than Western Europe and reputed to be one of the largest, richest, and most powerful states in the world. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta wrote about his very favourable impressions of this empire and said that he found complete and general safety there. When the famous emperor of Mali, Mansa Musa visited Cairo in 1324, it was said that he brought so much gold with him that its price fell dramatically and had not recovered its value even 12 years later. The empire of Songhai was known, amongst other things, for the famous University of Sankara based in Timbuktu. Aristotle was studied at Sankara and also subjects such as law, various branches of philosophy, dialectic, grammar, rhetoric and astronomy. In the 16th century one of its most famous scholars, Ahmed Baba, is said to have written more than 40 major books on subjects such as astronomy, history and theology, and he had his own private library that held over 1,500 volumes. One of the first reports of Timbuktu to reach Europe was by Leo Africanus. In his book, published in 1550, he says of the town, "There you will find many judges, professors, and devout men, all handsomely maintained by the king, who holds scholars in much honour. There too they sell many handwritten North African books, and more profit is to be made there from the sale of books than from any other branch of trade." African knowledge and that of the ancient world was transmitted to Europe as a result of the North African or Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century. There were in fact several such conquests, including two by the Berber dynasties in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Muslim invasion of Europe, and the founding of the state of Córdoba, reintroduced all the learning of the ancient world as well as the various contributions made by Islamic scholars and linked Europe much more closely with North and West Africa. Arabic numerals based on those used in India were introduced and they helped simplify mathematical calculations. Europe was also introduced to the learning of ancient world mainly through translations in Arabic of works in medicine, chemistry, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. So important was the knowledge found in Muslim Spain, that one Christian monk, Adelard of Bath, disguised himself as a Muslim in order to study at the university at Córdoba. Many historians believe that it was this knowledge, brought to Europe through Muslim Spain, which not only created the conditions for the Renaissance but also for the eventual expansion of Europe overseas in the 15th century. European views before the slave trade. Hakim Adi. Before the devastation of the transatlantic slave trade, important diplomatic and trading partnerships had developed between the rulers of European countries and those of Africa who saw each other as equals. Some of the earliest European visitors to Africa recognized that many African societies were as advanced or even more advanced than their own. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese trader Duarte Barbosa said of the East African city Kilwa, "There were many fair houses of stone and mortar, well arranged in streets. Around it were streams and orchards with many channels of sweet water." Of the inhabitants of Kilwa he reported, "They were finely clad in many rich garments of gold and silk and cotton, and the women as well, also with much gold and silver in chains and bracelets, which they wore on their legs and arms, and many jewelled earrings in their ears." A Dutch traveller to the Kingdom of Benin in the early 17th century sent home this report of the capital. "It looks very big when you enter it, for you go into a great broad street, which, though not paved, seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoes Street in Amsterdam. This street continues for about 4 miles and has no bend in it. At the gate where I went in on horseback, I saw a big wall, very thick and made of earth, with a deep ditch outside. Outside the gate there is a large suburb. Inside, as you go along the main street, you can see other broad streets on either side, and these are also straight. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close to the other and evenly placed beside the next, like our houses in Holland. Africans and the African continent have made enormous contributions to human history just as other peoples and continents have. It is the development of Eurocentric and racist views in Europe that have denied this fact and sought to negate the history of Africa and its peoples. Academic racism. Alik Shaeda. The legacy of the African Holocaust has made a profound effect on African academics. As Africans have a profound disinheritance in areas of social economic, there has also been a destructive disinheritance in areas of academics. We are playing on a chessboard where all the pieces are white. The volumes of published works by the Hitlers of the African Holocaust is impossible for Africans to gain any foothold and authorities' stance in their history. Year after year, the bookshelves are filled with one opinion. The most popular Africans are those singing from this music score. Some of the most racist and pejorative material today is taught in schools in an attempt to vindicate the continuation of academic racism. The self-referencing of the old boys like Hume and Kent is valid today because it is old, white, and used many, many times. It is thus impossible for the frustrated African to gain any ground because he/she is in a battle whose parameters are set by foes on a battlefield tipped economically, socially, in favor of the opposition. We often hear so-and-so is acknowledged by everyone to be one of the most prominent scholars of, so-and-so is always white. Scholarship is a white-only seat, academic apartheid with no room for debate. Aspects of academia which are dead and buried, but still in use. Any African academic discussing or having a positive take on Africa that contradicts their assertion is called Afrocentric, as if this form of opinion is a cultural slant loaded with the bias of a pseudo-history. They say with one breath that Eurocentric academics were men of their time but still keep saying these people were the definitive guide to Africa. How can you say something is wrong but keep using it as a definitive source? The complete dismantlement, deconstruction, of the academic paradigm of authority needs to be a first step in a pure analysis, and it is for Africans to adopt this approach as basis for articulating and imposing a new identity. And in this we cannot overlook the significance of linguistics as a function of oppression. See Agency. Language and Racism Against Africa. Alik Shaeda. To highlight the academic dilemma against Africans, it is necessarily to just cite one of Europe's key historians on slavery. The age of the work and the period it was written in seem to make little impression in universities today, who seem to neglect the social status of Africans in the time these so-called scholarly books were being written in. It also neglects to highlight the mindset of the authors of these works and their contribution to the obscuring and footnoting of African history and African contributions to civilization. Men who would be labeled by a self-determined African today are referenced and cited with little challenge. Despite all the new research and development, this dead racist scholarship is still held high as the authentic source on Africa. Almost as if the more you reference a bad source the more authentic it becomes. The foundation of history of Africa cannot be studied outside of the dynamics of race and racism in the writings of African conquerors. This is not to dismiss their entire work, but surely to raise the red flag of sincerity, and subsequently expose the agendas behind these scribbling. J.D. Fage sits high on this throne of anti-African rhetoric too. Today, however, some scholars assert that slavery did not have a wholly disastrous effect on those left behind in Africa. 3. Imagine stating that some scholars believed the Jewish Holocaust was not entirely disastrous. We must assume there is again some degree of salvation in the actions of the Europeans who saved Africa from their own continent. It is like saying the Jewish Holocaust was beneficial because some Jews got senior position in the Nazi army, or slavery was good because Africans got free Caribbean cruises. It is funny that if a person states that genocide was good for Jews, that person would be either considered mad or a neo-Nazi. However, to suggest slavery was good for Africans makes someone an academic. At its peak, the Atlantic slave trade took about 90,000 slaves per year out of a total population of around 25 million in just Guinea, where the vast majority originated. This number was significant, yet only a moderate annual growth rate in population was enough to sustain it by replacement. Therefore, the slave trade is unlikely to have caused a decrease in the population of West Africa, though it may have reduced or even halted population growth in some regions. 4. Again, we see the apology and denial of the consequences of enslavement v. What this is saying is the harvesting of African people was done sustainable and that it had no demographic consequences on birth rate. It would be worth mentioning that the most virile and healthiest members were been exported overseas, so it is inconceivable that it would not affect population demographics, not to mention settlement patterns and human social potential. The Nok civilization is argued by some to prove that Africa had a civilization prior to the arrival of Europe. This kind of tone appears to vindicate Africa, but it actually introduces reasonable doubt. It references again the false notion of a primitive Africa as a half-valid hypothesis, for it shows by implication that anything or everything in Africa has to be articulated by juxtaposition. African civilization does not require any proof or revolutionary rethink. This kind of reasoning follows from "he seems very educated for a black," or "you see they are not all savages." What needs to be done is exposed the motives behind those removing African agency from the annals of world cultural contributions. For those left behind in Africa, the standard of living increased substantially and the region became divided into highly centralized and powerful nation-states, such as Dahomey and the Ashanti Confederacy. It also created a class of very wealthy and highly Europeanized traders who began to send their children to European universities. 6. The contempt in Eurocentrism is so self-evident it almost needs no commentary to identify either intention or fallacies. It is be restated the source of this material comes from a respected seminal academic and authority on Africa. Before Europe, we know the Kenka Musa had gold reserves that made ancient Mali one of the richest economies in the ancient world. It is also a fact that Sankara was an African university so notable that Arabs and others came to study there. All of these non-direct facts retort the claims that contact with Europe brought power and education. Also, the statement about Europeanized traders is intended by the author as a compliment, a kind of accession of the African from savage beast to Europeanized. Phage trips and stabs himself with his own pen and exposes and implements himself as one of the historical agents of academic racism that has distorted the African historical timeline. Black Africa is a racist term. Alik Shaeda. Nobody on this planet puts an adjective on their identity, especially when they are a majority, except African people. Black Africa, dark continent, heart of darkness, all articulate the colonial contempt for a continent and its people. But how does one arrive at the term Black Africans? Are there green Africans? Would you speak of yellow Chinese, or brown Indians? Globally, the term Red Indian is rejected as deeply pejorative, yet Black African is still used even in South Africa, which is used to define the majority of the population against the minority so-called white Africans. Black African is as ridiculous as rock stone. Rocks are stones, so why double up two realities which are often the same? There is only one reason the term Black African exists, and that is to deny nobility from African people. To explain away how Egypt could be nested in Africa but at the same time divorced from the majority of the African people. Therefore the argument, yes, it is in Africa, but it is not Black African. It is almost like saying Greece was a European civilization, but not a white European civilization. If 95% of Africans are black, capital B, if it must be used, then the minority should bear the adjective, not the majority. It is disrespectful to describe Africans with a label based solely on a color, especially when it does not accurately reflect the physical appearance of most Africans. This is made even more offensive when the etymological root of that label, black, is derived from the word Negro, and is used in place of the word African as a racial or cultural identity. In reality, we must ask ourselves, what is the difference between Negro and black save historical association? The words mean the same thing. So we have moved from being black in Spanish, Negro, to black in English, black. It is strange that despite all the genetic research and advanced human anthropology, we are still clinging to primitive 18th century post-Darwin model of race, which sole aim was / to segregate and deculturalize and enslave. The concept of a Black Africa is a Eurocentric term based upon their ignorant primitive regressive deductions. It is true Arabs and Greeks referred to Africans as black, but this was not a racial label, and moreover Africans themselves did not self-apply these external labels. Like the Phoenician who were called the Red People, but no Phoenician would have referred to themselves in this way. Sub-Saharan Africa is a racist colonial construction. Alik Shaeda. The committee also chose a continent-based approach, which considers Africa as a whole and abandons the usual dichotomy between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. UNESCO, Decolonizing History. Sub-Saharan Africa is a linguistic vestige of racist colonialism, nested in the notion of divide and rule, which articulates a perception based on European terms of homogeneity. The notion of some invisible border, which divides the north of African from the south, is rooted in racism, which in part assumes that sand is an obstacle for African language and culture. This band of sand hence confines Africans to the bottom of a European-imposed location, which exists neither linguistically, Afro-Asiatic languages, ethnically, Tuareg, politically, African Union, Arab League, economically, Sensat, or physically, Sudan and Chad. The overemphasis on sand as a defining feature in African history is grossly misleading, as cultures, trade, and languages do not stop when they meet geographic deserts. Thus Sub-Africa is another divisive vestige of colonial domination which balkanized Africa, assigning everything below the waist belt of Africa as negative. Rebellion. The image is always given that the Africans themselves acquiesce to the process of slavery. But you'll find that in West Africa there was a polity or a political entity that existed that guaranteed security right across West Africa, and that was the Songhai Empire. We saw the emergence of Nasser ud-Din in the 16th century. We saw Malik Sy in the 16th century as well, and men like Abdul Qadir and Cherno Suleiman Kaba, these men who waged resistance in what is known as Fouta Toro and Fouta Jalan. We had Nzinga in the southern areas of Africa as well that was fighting its resistance against European invasion. All the way up until the 17th century, men like Sheikh Uthman Dan Fotiad and Umar Futi as well as Ahmed Lobo. And then we had the Courageous Wars, which took place in 1884 under the armies of Muhammad Ahmed, ibn Abdullahi of the Sudan as well as Muhammad Abdullahi al-Hassan of Somalia. And then we had in 1903 finally, the wars that took place between the Sokoto Empire. So the Africans did not acquiesce colonialism, nor did they acquiesce towards slavery. They fought at every point, and in fact when the slaves were landing in the Western Hemisphere in Bahia, Brazil, you saw the emergence of jihad movements. You saw the emergence of men like Muhammad Sambo, who led a 2-month jihad in the Louisiana territories in North America. Men like Nat Turner and other men who refused to submit to slavery. The Haitian Revolution as well. Men like Macanto. So the Africans never acquiesced to slavery. In fact, we can say this year that the whole concept of freedom that the American 13 colonies had, they got that concept of freedom and liberty from the African resistance movement that took place in the Western Hemisphere. What did the slave master learn from Bahia et al? That it was critical to separate the African, the one who just arrived with a memory of home, from the conditioned slave, the one born into enslavement. Teaching the conditioned slave to hate anything African, anyone who remembers another home is dangerous to the designs of slavery. See African Revolt. 1. Enslaved Africans came primarily from a region stretching from the Senegal River in northern Africa to Angola in the south. 2. Europeans divided this stretch of land into 5 coasts. Upper Guinea Coast, the area delineated by the Senegal and Gambia rivers. Ivory, or Kwa or Windward, Coast Central Liberia. Lower Guinea Coast, divided into the Gold Coast on the west, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, the Slave Coast, Togo, Benin, and western Nigeria, and the Bight of Benin, Nigeria and Cameroon. Gabon. Angola. 3. The Angolan coast supplied nearly half the slaves sent to the Americas. Organization. 1. The notion of ethnic groups, combing a common language and customs with a political structure is mistaken. Atlantic Africa was divided into states, political units, and nations, cultural units. Slavery was a royal enterprise. The European kings sponsored slavery and issued asientos, royal slaving permits. These were sold to the elite merchants of the day and become items of value like stocks and shares today. Ovando, the Spanish governor of Hispaniola, complained not to export any more Africans as they were aggressive and reinforcing the ranks of resistance among the Native Americans. These early imported Muslim Africans were proving hard to handle, but as labor shortage got critical due to the waning of the indigenous population, Ovando reassessed the situation and demanded that Africans be sent. Royal decree targeted the Guinea coast in a mandate, which was to avoid the Islamic African influence. However, over the duration of the trade, approximately 30% of those sent to the New World were Muslims. 2. While some states were quite large, others were quite modest in size and many were tiny, consisting of a capital town of a few thousand people and a dozen villages under its control. 3. In the 17th century, 70% of the people lived in states with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. 4. Private wealth usually derived from control of dependents, clients, pawns, wives in polygynous households, and indentured servants. African slavery. 1. African law recognized slavery but respected the culture and lineage of those that were enslaved. Slaves were also part of the family, and often the line between slave and non-slave was blurred. 2. A relatively low population density existed in Africa as compared to Europe and Asia. This low density had profound impact on Africa's development potential after slavery became an economic mainstay of Europe. 3. Slavery had existed in the medieval empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and slave exports had supplemented the export of gold. Most of those enslaved were prisoners of war or debt criminals. Large prisons were not a concept, and hence slavery was a system to deal with undesirables. 4. Although African slavery was generally domestic slavery akin to indentured servitude, in Africa the enslaved were used in a wider variety of ways than in the New World. They were employed as agricultural workers, soldiers, scribes, servants, and government officials. 5. The great majority of slaves sold to Europeans were not slaves in Africa, they were usually recent war captives or victims of banditry and judicial proceedings. 6. Chattel slavery, manumission and social ascension were very rare. 7. Multi-generational slavery was uncommon in Africa, in part this reflected the fact that most African slaves were women. 8. During the early years of enslavement, African slaves usually worked under supervision. Then many became allotment slaves, who worked 5 or 6 days until about 2 p.m. on the master's lands, and in the evenings and on their days off, worked their own plots. In the third stage, settled slaves spent most of their time working their land in exchange for a fixed obligation, usually what it took to feed an adult male for a year. Slave trade. 1. During the era of the Atlantic slave trade, 90% of those enslaved were sent to the Caribbean and the South America. 2. The Atlantic slave trade carried about 2 to 3 men for every woman. 3. The slave trade reduced the adult male population by about 20%, dramatically altering the ratio of working adults to dependents and of adult men to adult women. 4. One result of unbalanced sex ratios was to further encourage polygyny. 5. Another result was to reduce traditional male forms of work, such as hunting, fishing, livestock rearing, the clearing of fields, the chopping down of trees, and the digging up of roots. The result was a less protein-rich diet and a reduction in agricultural productivity. 6. About 14% of slaves sent to the New World were children under 14, 56% were male adults, and 30% were female adults. Myths and misconceptions about slavery. Myth: slavery is a product of capitalism. Fact: the transatlantic slave trade is in direct relationship with modern concepts of exploitive capitalism. Capitalism was the driver behind the transatlantic slave trade, see Eric Williams. Myth: slavery is a product of Western civilization. Fact: slavery is virtually a universal institution. However, the industrialized chattel slavery, the race-based nature and the duration are peculiar to the transatlantic slave trade. Myth: slavery in the non-Western world was a mild, benign, and non-economic institution. Fact: slaves were always subject to torture, sexual exploitation, and arbitrary death. However, the scale of the brutality and the institutionalization of people as chattel was unique in type and proliferation in the Western slave models. Myth: slavery was an economically backward and inefficient institution. Fact: many of the most progressive societies in the world had slaves. Forms of slavery allowed the building of many of the world's empires. Today the low-wage lower classes and machines fill the roles slaves traditionally did in society. So still the wealthy today exist because of some form of exploitation of the majority. Myth: slavery was always based on race. Fact: not until the 15th century was slavery associated primarily with people of African descent. Race became a factor which justified enslavement once it became the mainstay of Western economies. See Black Codes. Enslavement and the slave trade. Myth: New World slaves came exclusively from West Africa. Fact: half of all New World slaves came from Central Africa. Myth: Europeans physically enslaved Africans or hired mercenaries who captured people for export, or that African rulers were Holocaust abettors who were themselves to blame for the slave trade. Fact: Europeans did engage in some slave raiding. The majority of people who were transported to the Americas were enslaved by Africans in Africa. Europeans politically created anarchy in Africa, feeding greed and putting others in a dilemma as sell or be sold. With the destruction of the economy and the absences of the most virile in African societies, slavery became a mono-economy, feeding the cycle of destruction. Europeans created mechanisms which ensured conflict and the push-pull demand for slaves. Myth: many slaves were captured with nets. Fact: there is no evidence that slaves were captured with nets. War was the most important source of enslavement. Myth: kidnapping was the usual means of enslavement. Fact: war was the most important source of enslavement. It would be incorrect to reduce all of these wars to slave raids. Myth: the Middle Passage stripped enslaved Africans of their cultural heritage and transformed them into docile, passive figures wholly receptive to the cultural inputs of their masters. Fact: slaves engaged in at least 250 documented shipboard rebellions. The destruction of African culture happened not on the slave ships but via the plantation system, where Christianity and terror were used to mentally enslave African people. Evidence shows that in areas where new African slaves were constantly being introduced, such as Jamaica, had more incidences of rebellion due to the resistance of the new arrivals. Slavery in the Americas. Myth: most slaves were imported into what is now the United States. Fact: well over 90% of slaves from Africa were imported into the Caribbean and South America. Myth: slavery played a marginal role in the history of the Americas. Fact: African slaves were the only remedy for the labor shortages that plagued Europe's New World dominions. Fact: slave labor made it profitable to mine for precious metal and to harvest sugar, indigo, and tobacco. Slaves taught whites how to raise such crops as rice and indigo. Myth: Europeans arrived in the New World in far larger numbers than did Africans. Fact: before 1820, the number of Africans outstripped the combined total of European immigrants by a ratio of 3, 4, or 5 to 1. Myth: the first slaves arrived in what is now the U.S. in 1619. Fact: slaves arrived in Spanish Florida at least a century before 1619, and a recently uncovered census shows that blacks were present in Virginia before 1619. Slave culture. Myth: the slave trade permanently broke slaves' bonds with Africa. Fact: slaves were able to draw upon their African cultural background and experiences and use them as a basis for life in the New World. The drum and the griot tradition are still alive in the music of the diaspora. The food and elements of the language, the social structure, the cool still are defining characteristics of the African diaspora. The greatest disconnection with Africa may have actually happened post-emancipation, where being American or being more integrated allowed cultural drift into a more Eurocentric identity. Myth: plantation life with its harsh labor, unstable families, and high mortality made it difficult for Africans to construct social ties. Fact: African nations persisted in America well into the 18th century and even the early 19th century, despite the overt destruction of the family, the denouncement of religious and marital values. Myth: masters assigned names to slaves, or slaves imitated masters' systems of naming. Fact: in fact, slaves were rarely named for owners. Naming patterns appear to have reflected African practices, such as the custom of giving children day names, after the day they were born, and namesaking, such as naming children after grandparents. Myth: slaveholders sought to deculturate slaves by forbidding African names and languages and obliterating African culture. Fact: while deculturation was part of the project of slavery, in fact African music, dance, decoration, design, cuisine, and religion exerted a profound, ongoing influence on American culture. Fact: slaves adapted religious rites and perpetuated a rich tradition of folklore. Economics of slavery. Myth: slaveholders lost money and were more interested in status than money-making. Slaves did little productive work. Fact: slaves worked longer days, and more of their life. The life expectancy of enslaved Africans in places like Barbados was a few decades due to the strain of labor. Myth: slavery was incompatible with urban life and factory technology. Fact: sugar mills were the first true factories in the world. Slaves were widely used in cities and in various kinds of manufacturing and crafts. Myth: slaves engaged almost exclusively in unskilled brutish field labor. Fact: much of the labor performed by slaves required high skill levels and careful, painstaking effort. Fact: masters relied on slaves for skilled craftsmanship. Religion. Myth: West and Central Africans received their first exposure to Christianity in the New World. Fact: most Africans learned about Christianity as they learned about the European trade in enslaved Africans. A few Catholic missionary activities began in the Central African Kingdom of Congo half a century before Columbus's voyages of discovery, and Congo converted to Catholicism in 1491. Myth: the Catholic Church did not tolerate the mixture of Catholicism with traditional African religions. Fact: in Congo and in Latin America, the Church did tolerate the mixture of Catholicism with African religions, allowing Africans to retain their old cosmology, understanding of the universe, and the place of gods and other divine beings in the universe. Myth: before the Civil War, the Southern churches were highly segregated. Fact: in 1860, slave constituted about 26% of the Southern Baptist Church membership. Myth: slave Christianity was essentially a religion of docility. Fact: Christianity was dual-edged and marked by millennialist possibilities. Whites could not prevent black preachers from turning Christianity into a source of self-respect and faith in deliverance. Resistance. Myth: slaves were brainwashed and stunned into submission and rarely resisted slavery. Fact: resistance took a variety of forms ranging from day-to-day resistance, economic bargaining, running away and maroonage, and outright rebellions. Slavery and world history. 1. The most ancient civilizations: ancient Mesopotamia, Old Kingdom Egypt, and the budding civilization that formed in the Indus and Yangtze River valleys all had some form of slavery present in their earliest years. 2. In none of these cultures did slaves constitute a large proportion of the population. 3. It was in classical Greece and Rome that the first true slave societies came into existence. From the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC, perhaps a third to a half of Athens's population consisted of slaves. Slaves constituted as much as 30% of Rome's population. 4. England's Domesday Book of 1086 indicated that 10% of the population was enslaved. 5. Although slavery is often stigmatized as archaic and backward, slavery has been found in many of the most progressive societies. 6. Contrary to what many think, slavery never disappeared from medieval Europe. Domestic slavery persisted in Sicily, southern Italy, Russia, southern France, Spain, and elsewhere. Curse of Ham. The claim that Noah, the biblical father of all subsequent humanity, cursed his son Ham with both blackness and the condition of slavery for looking at him drunk and naked and exposing him to his other sons, Shem and Japheth. In fact, Ham was not cursed, and his association with black slavery does not appear in the Hebrew Bible. Noah cursed Canaan, the ancestor of the Semitic Canaanites, who occupied Israel before the Hebrews, to be the servant of servants. Why Noah was upset with Canaan we are never told. According to some sources it was for a homosexual act, looking on his nakedness. Ham's African sons were Cush, Ethiopia, Put, Libya, and Misraim, Egypt, and they were not cursed. Maroons. Independent communities of fugitive slaves. Task system. One of two plantation labor systems. Under the task system, slaves were assigned several specific tasks within a day. When those tasks were finished, slaves could have time to themselves to spend however they wished. Slaves who worked in rice and long staple cotton plantations, in the naval stores industry, or in skilled labor positions worked under the task system. The benefits of this system for slaves included less supervision, more autonomy, and more free time. Gang system. Wherever tobacco, sugar, or short staple cotton grew, slaves worked in large groups or gangs under the strict supervision of white overseers or black drivers from dawn to dusk. Close supervision meant less autonomy and less free time. Trash gangs. Many boys and girls performed light agricultural labor, sweeping yards, clearing dried corn stalks from fields, chopping cotton, carrying water to field hands, weeding, picking cotton at a slower pace, feeding work animals, and driving cows to pasture. The slave trade contributed to Africa's depopulation, to the increased use of slaves within Africa, to the development of more predatory political systems, and to a greater gap between rich and poor. John Fage, a no-racist who is one of the leading Eurocentrics who whitewash slavery. He rejected the argument that slave exports led to serious depopulation and contended that the slave trade contributed to political centralization and economic growth. Eric Williams, racism was the result and not the cause of slavery. Slave economies were a major source of capital for the Industrial Revolution. Abolition came when slave economies were declining in profitability. Abolition was driven more by economic interests than by philanthropy. Frank Tannenbaum. Compared to British colonists, Latin Americans were less tainted by racial prejudice, were more lenient in their treatment of slaves, and extended religious and legal protections involving families and physical cruelty. Carl Degler. Demographic necessity led the Portuguese in Brazil to promote freedmen and mulattoes into positions of social respectability. In the U.S., poor white yeomanry supported racism to protect their position in society. Key controversies. 1. The vast majority of New World slaves were captured, bought, traded, and employed by non-Jews. 2. Some Jews participated in the slave trade, owned slaves, and even helped formulate and disseminate the pro-slavery ideology. Other Jews, including the Cincinnati abolitionist Max Lilienthal, Isaac Wise, and Rabbi David Einhorn of Baltimore, attacked slavery. 3. The Jewish expulsion from Spain coincided with establishment of trading links between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. As a result, the Sephardim found themselves dispersed over critical nodes of the new system, transferring assets and information. 4. The only place where Jews came close to dominating a New World plantation system was the Dutch colonies of Curaçao and Suriname. 5. In the antebellum South, about 5,000 Jews, out of 20,000, owned one or more slaves, making up 1.25% of Southern slave owners. 6. The largest Jewish slaveholders were Judah P. Benjamin owned 140 slaves near New Orleans, and Major Raphael J. Moses owned 50 slaves near Columbus, Georgia. 7. No Southern Jewish intellectual questioned the injustice of slavery. Major rebellions. New York City, 1712. Like many later revolts, this one occurred during a period of social dissension among whites following Leisler's rebellion. The rebels espoused traditional African religion. Stono Rebellion, 1739. The Spanish Empire enticed slaves of English colonies to escape to Spanish territory. In 1733 Spain issued an edict to free all runaway slaves from British territory who made their way into Spanish possessions. On September 9, 1739, about 20 slaves, mostly from Angola, gathered under the leadership of a slave called Jemmy near the Stono River, 20 miles from Charleston. 44 blacks and 21 whites lost their lives. South Carolina responded by placing import duties on slaves from abroad, strengthening patrol duties and militia training, and recommending more benign treatment of slaves. Gabriel's Rebellion, 1800. This attempted insurrection near Richmond was organized during the Haitian Revolution and the undeclared naval war between the U.S. and France. Denmark Vesey's Conspiracy, 1822. This failed insurrection was organized soon after the contentious debate over the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Like Gabriel, Vesey consciously looked to Haiti for inspiration and support. Nat Turner, 1832. This insurrection took place at a time when slaves in Jamaica had staged one of the largest revolts in history, when radical abolition had arisen in the North, and Britain was debating slave emancipation. This article is not an original article on the topic, but a variety of articles compiled to illuminate on various aspects of African before slavery.